Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years experience with cybersecurity. 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
Hey, welcome, Ian. I want to thank you for joining me today. So why don't you tell the audience who you are and what it is that you do?
Hey, thanks a lot, Aaron. Ian Frist. Currently, I work at Corning in our compliance team. I run our compliance organization inside the cybersecurity group. So my background, I kind of fell into ICS OT by mistake, starting out in cyber with the National Guard. Got pulled into some things there, some interesting opportunities. That's a fun rabbit hole. I'm actually a medic as my MOS in the Guard, so it's like, how'd you get into cyber? And it's just one of those cool things that the National Guard leverages, right? So fell into ICS OT, loved it. As I was working through some different, career fields there, I got pulled more into compliance, mostly because, it was kind of like, hey, you're still in the National Guard. You should know what the CMMC thing is, so go figure it out. So got kind of more into compliance, the GRC side of the house, and now that's really where I focus. I've never left. Love it. Still try to find excuses to speak at places like SANS conferences if I can. Always surprised every year if I ever get accepted. Every time I do get accepted, it's always like, wow, okay, cool. But yeah, so that's where I am now, focused mostly on the GRC side of the house, but still working in manufacturing companies, still not far away from the ICS OT. So.
That's awesome. That's an amazing story. Again, a lot of us have kind of dropped into this IT or OT world and from different, my background, I came from IT but I also, one of my first jobs was in power utility and in this OT space way before it was ever called OT or there was anything called even cybersecurity, right? But, my dad worked in a power utility industry for 40 plus years. So I kind of grew up around OT. So I don't know, maybe it came a little natural to me just because I saw it, I was exposed to it. So when I did later in my career get kind of thrust upon it, it was almost natural, but it also gave me a unique perspective because I've seen the other side. Like I've seen IT and I've worked in IT. So what lessons have you learned by being thrown into this space? Like you talked about being a medic and that how that kind of threw you into the OT side, which is an awesome story. I would love to get into at some point, even if it's offline. So.
Yeah, I think for me, starting out kind of in the ICS OT space, I had the different background. I mean, everybody gets a little bit of an IT background if you're coming in, right? Sure. So I was doing an undergrad in IT, but I think for me, what it built is a really solid understanding and love of how OT is different, but also how important it is. I mean, I just truly, I think manufacturing, I think OT, it's more interesting to me, even though they're, dumber systems, right? I love that they affect the real world. So to me, that's the draw. And I learned that because of the way I fell into it, I think. And I've also been able to hold on to that perspective, which I think is incredibly crucial when you're trying to protect OT, is knowing, hey, like you said, you came up through, it was in your family, so you understood that people had to go work with these systems, that to have these systems had to run and they had to produce power and do important things. And when you grow up kind of in that environment or you fall into that environment, you get to go see what actually happens in that environment, which is, I think, an important perspective that a lot of other people lose or could lose if they come just from the IT side of the house and they come into OT, if they don't spend time getting to know those environments. So that helped me a lot.
Yeah, the consequences can be vastly different, right?
Right.
Growing up in the IT world, the worst thing that would happen is I'd have to go in on the weekend or, the email server's down. I've got to do a restore. But, there's not a life issue. Nobody's losing their life. We're not out of power. We're not, I'm not impacting the whole city from being able to,
right.
for people to be able to go to work, right? It just, Bob can't get to his email until Monday morning, like he'll live.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Like, I mean, IT breaches are terrible, right? And they have huge consequences. But at the end of the day, it's affecting ones and zeros in data, and that data is important, and we need to get to that data. But OT, I mean, yeah, if you're in utilities, somebody doesn't have power, somebody doesn't have water. If you're in manufacturing, if it's one of your critical sites, I mean, you maybe in an IT breach, sure, you can't get to that data, but in an OT breach, that site might be down for ages, right? Depending on how it was taken down. If it affected the physical side of the house, right? I mean, that has such far-reaching consequences. So the stakes are higher, I think, in OT, and that's kind of an alert as well.
Yeah, for sure. So talk about compliance, because I know compliance. So I've talked a lot about compliance on this podcast. Coming again, power utility, NERC SIP, all that kind of stuff. So many focus or lose. They miss the point of compliance, and they're like, oh, I have to do that because it's compliance. They check the boxes, what I like to say, but they miss the meat of why it's there, why it's a baseline, and how it can be powerful to empower your OT environment and make a stronger, cybersecurity program, because you have these compliance, almost hammers or sticks that you can use to say, no, we can't not do this. Like, this is not optional. Let's do the right thing, not just because we want to check the box, but let's do it the right way.
Yeah, 100%. I think one takeaway message I love to leave everybody with is the auditors are coming, right? So one thing that's different, that's changing in our world is, you're right, power, NERC SIP, that's been happening for decades now, right? Yeah. Power's used to it. There is, I think, a trend in power that it's a lot of compliance chasing rather than maybe holistic security programs, which is an issue that we can get into with compliance. But if you're in manufacturing, if you're in utility, outside of utilities, the audits are coming, and that's the biggest shift I think we're seeing, are things like CMMC. CMMC does not ignore the OT at all. At level 2, you have to have an asset inventory to network diagram at a minimum. That's not easy for a lot of manufacturing companies. It should be easy, but we know it's not, right? You have to have controls in place that you show you used a risk management plan and strategies and policies to put in place. Again, that's a level of maturity a lot of manufacturing companies don't have. At level 3, the documents that got kind of released the other day that weren't really supposed to be released, we got to see the scoping guide for level 3, which actually put OT fully in scope. So, and talked about like intermediary devices, and nobody knows what that means yet. So, what I take away from that is that compliance is coming to all these organizations that didn't see it before, and it's coming to your ICS and your OT, not just your IT environments. The good thing is it doesn't seem yet to be overly prescriptive, right? It's not like NERC SIP where it says you have to do this, and this, right? It's giving you broad strokes to start. Have a risk management plan, have an asset inventory, have a network diagram, and like you said, that's a great stick. That's a good thing they're coming, because now you have that lever to pull on to invest in your OT, to say, hey, we need to go do this and build a program, to actually secure our OT environment, not just the IT. So that's the biggest shift I think I'm seeing in compliance, is that all of them, whether it's, CMMC or the new stuff coming out of Europe with the NIS 1 and 2, all these different things are all pointing towards the OT as well. They're not ignoring it. CMMC carves out a specific category in their scoping guides for ICS OT assets, which should tell you everything you need to know about how the compliance frameworks are changing, I think.
Yeah, and like you said, NERC SIP has come. It's been around for a long time, but again, so I've worked I worked for a large consulting firm, one of the big four, and so I had customers in manufacturing and you name it, a lot of the different verticals. But it was amazing how power utility is old, and nobody in OT, I would say, is as advanced or capable as an IT environment. We're just behind the 8 ball. But you go to a power generation site and a power company, because of NERC SIP, they are more mature in their OT cybersecurity than any other vertical I've been to. And it's not a lack of funding, and we're talking big companies, the Cornings of the world, and you name it, the big name companies of the world, they just don't have that requirement yet. So some of them struggle. And I'm not saying Corning is struggling. I just mean that it doesn't matter the size of the company. It can be a small company, a big company, a medium company. But because they don't have that thou shalt thing out there, like that requirement stick has really worked. A lot of folks are not necessarily for regulation and government overreach, and I'm not trying to get political, but the point is like looking at the reason for this. Like the reason it was pushed into NERC-CIP is because they saw, hey, if we don't force this, some people are not going to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Like many will, but that one guy, a chain's only strong as its weakest link. So we have to make sure everyone is doing at least this. And that's kind of the overarching theory behind, that pushing that regulation and forcing that compliance.
And it's so important to realize when you look at these compliance regulations, a lot of people say, oh, they don't let me manage my risk, right? Well, no, they encourage you to manage your risk. But at the end of the day, the regulating body that's pushing that compliance, whether it's DOD with CMMC or, whether it's the government with NERC-CIP, right? They're saying we have an acceptable and tolerable level of risk that we're willing to accept in this sector, and we need to keep our companies below that, right? And it's a pretty high threshold. It's a very, very high threshold, but you have to look at it from that perspective, right? Like DOD has said that for us to mitigate the risk that we see to controlled unclassified information, we need to implement these controls at a base level at every company. So they're not taking risk management out of it. They're not taking your ability to decide your own fate out of it, but they are saying you must do at least this general thing to mitigate our risk to an acceptable, tolerable level. And it's still a pretty high level, right? It's just a baseline, like you said. But I do see a lot of that. They say, oh, well, we want to manage our risk more effectively, and we should decide what controls to put in place. Like, nah, you get to decide what goes in after these, but you've got to see it from that perspective, which I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, the analogy I like to give sometimes is it's like seatbelts. Like, I grew up I was born in the 70s, so I grew up I didn't have seatbelts. Like as a kid, I'm in the bed of the truck and, driving around East Texas, and we didn't have seatbelts. Like, again, I was in the bed of the truck. I wasn't even in the cab of the truck. Of course, I've got 3 kids. I would never allow that to happen now. But that regulation says, okay, everybody, there's got to be seatbelts in every car. First of all, that was the first step to make sure that they actually put them in the vehicles. And then secondly, everybody's got to wear them. I don't care if in the beginning it was just in the front seat, and then it was, in the back seat. And now it's just, my kids, they don't even think about it. They get in the car and they buckle their seatbelts. And so do I. But it's funny how, like, my parents, when my kids get in the car with my parents, sometimes they put their seatbelts on or sometimes they don't. They're annoyed because the car beeps at them if they don't. Like, it's just, they knew that, hey, that is a minimum baseline for safety in driving at these cars that drive 100 miles an hour, all these different speeds and all these risks. Let's lower that risk by forcing it, like making that the minimum baseline is at least put in a seatbelt.
Right. It's a start to reducing risk. And there's another piece on that you talked about that I want to circle back to. I just thought of is, you talk about how electric and utilities are so far ahead, and they are so much more mature. And one of my sort of, I don't know if I'm going to call it a pet peeve, but it's sort of a pet peeve, right, is that a lot of vendors out there, a lot of products out there are focused on those organizations, right? A lot of these automated security tools and the monitoring tools and the things like that, they're focused on those organizations. And these other organizations that are no less important, right? Because, manufacturing, we saw manufacturing and supply chain, we saw during COVID how crucial that is, right? And what happens when it starts to slow down or we start to see issues with it, the blips hurt. But there aren't as many products tailored for those less mature organizations where they aren't ready for snazzy monitoring because they don't have the asset inventory in the network diagram, right? Sure. But a lot of vendors will still go out and push them, right? So we're at an interesting convergence here, right? Where we've been pushing forever for people to get more advanced in their OT cybersecurity, and electric has done it, right? Utilities have done it. Not water, right? They're lagging behind. They're always lagging behind. They don't have enough money, right? But even they're moving, right? Yeah. But manufacturing, as they see these compliance initiatives, if they see these other things coming in, as they see more attacks and their risks go up, they're looking for how do I better secure my environment too? And we almost have to take where we were, 7 to 10 years ago with electric and what we were focusing on then and focus on that now with manufacturing in a lot of cases. And I think even consultants and vendors, we lose sight of that sometimes. Even the trainings we see, right? They're moving more towards securing and advanced tools that you're not always ready for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's easy to walk in, again, I worked for a large consulting firm, so, it was very easy for them to walk in and come out with this assessment that's, 200 pages long and has all of these controls and all these different things and how bad, it's like, you wrote the paper in high school and it's just red everywhere. That's overwhelming and not
Yeah.
helpful. Like
And where do I start?
Exactly. What do I do? Like, I've got all this red. Like, can you help me here? Like, well, I can't do all of this. I'm doing nothing. And now you tell me everything I'm doing or all the things that I'm not, instead of, okay, here's how you start. Like, you know, let's put in firewall or whatever that thing is, like that entry level baseline. And that gets back to, you know, compliance is a part of your overall risk profile. It's understanding I need to build a program around my OT environment, and compliance and risk and tools are just a piece of that. You know, obviously I work for a software company and my product does some things, but you can't go buy any product in the market and it solve all your problems. Like, it is not a product problem. Because I can have the best products in the world, if I don't have the training and the resources and the policies and procedures and the overall program to manage and run it, it doesn't help me. Like, it's just a tool that sits in my garage and doesn't get used.
And we're seeing, I think we're seeing some parts of industry, especially in compliance, start to recognize that, right? Because look at the new CSF changes. They added a governance domain, right? So NIST is realizing governance is important. Those of us that have worked in the field have known that for a long time, but it's still lacking, right? That mandate to govern, that understanding that, you know, we have to have that overarching program to drive things. So I think we're seeing those changes, but you're right. I mean, the tool can't do it all for you, and you've got to have foundational things in place, and you've got to. I like to stress programs. You have to build cybersecurity programs, not go buy just solutions. Programs are going to have solutions as part of them, right? And they're going to solve problems, but you can't solve something at a point in time. You know, it's got to be a program that works holistically.
Yeah, you know, it's like if you're designing a car, like, you know, yes, you don't pick the paint job. Maybe somebody is, but you're not putting in the motor. You're not building the motor before you have a chassis. Like, you don't even have a car. You don't know what kind of car am I building? I'm building a truck. Am I doing a sports car? Like, it's hard to jump to, I want this 1,000 horsepower twin turbo, you know, V8 if I'm putting it into an EV. Like, I just wasted all of my time, effort, and experience. And it's not going to help me. Or maybe it's going to work, but it's not going to get me, you know, I need to be able to haul a bunch of stuff, not go really fast. So it really, you've got to build that under overarching program to understand, where am I going to focus? Which controls do I want to focus on? You know, what does my environment look like? And you said it is in the beginning of this, right? Is so many in OT, and it's not just manufacturing; it's all verticals. And power utility is just as bad. They don't have an understanding of what their assets are, and that is just like a foundational thing. It's kind of like, how do I protect what I don't know I have? Like, how do I know where my struggles are? How can I know good or know bad or look for bad if I don't even know what good looks like, right? That's kind of the start of your program should be, okay, what do I have? Where are my holes? Where am I missing? It's that assessment thing, but you don't want to just get the piece of paper that's just red everywhere. You want to have some understanding of what I have so I can actually take some actions and do something about it.
Yeah, I like to say unknown unknowns, right? If you don't do that groundwork, get on the ground, build those foundational things, asset inventories, network diagrams, data flow diagrams. If you don't have those, it's going to be an unknown that gets you every time, and you can't point a tool to something that you have no clue exists. You can get a lot of them, but those high latency air gap systems, right? Like, they're going to catch you every time. Tools don't always find those, right? Something that's depending on what kind of network device it's behind a tool. No tool finds it. So those areas will get you every time, because the tool is only as good as the information you give it on the front end, right? And I don't care which buzzword you pick, AI, blockchain, whatever the hot one is today, that doesn't change that. We still have to know our environments. I think that's crucial.
And so, again, coming from manufacturing, what are some of the struggles that you've seen just in asset management and asset inventory, right? So a lot of the devices are old, and some of them are analog, some of them are disconnected. You know, there's all of these problems, and no one person understands them all, right?
I think it's an interesting, one thing I see is the mix of the new and the old, right? That mix and that disparity is making life more difficult in every vertical, day by day, right? So as we still have these legacy devices that do great things, that are analog or early digital, right? And then we bring in brand new devices that are running on modern operating systems and can have EDR, and you can actually scan them without knocking them over, and all these great functionalities. protecting both is difficult, right? And even sometimes maybe devices that would classically live higher in the Purdue model, just because of their limited functionality compared to the new devices, you might have to look at like, do I still drop them down lower in my planning, right? Do I still segment them differently? Do I can apply risk? You have to apply risk differently, but then what controls do you put in? So I think that's an interesting space we're in right now as that happens. And I think that's a challenge that we're going to continue to face, because those legacy systems, like if you're making a widget and you've used the same machine to make that widget for 30 years, you're not going to go buy a new machine. I mean, companies aren't going to just up and buy a new machine because the widget's great, the machine making the widget's great, and the R&D time and everything else to go into a new machine to make that widget, it doesn't always equal out. So we have to plan on, we can't always just say, hey, replace it, hey, upgrade. We have to plan on how do we protect both, right? And don't assume the modern stuff gets protected just because it's modern. That's a bad assumption, right? But don't assume you can protect the modern stuff the same way you protect the legacy stuff, because then you lose functionality. These things need to talk to the internet. They need to get out. They need to do things. They need to get updates, right? So we can't protect it the same way we protected the old stuff, but how do we protect both?
Yeah. And again, coming from both IT and OT, that's one of the things I think as an OT professional and doing this on the OT side of the wall, I think it's a lot harder in some ways, right? So obviously both sides have difficulties, and from the IT side, the attack path is bigger and things are exposed on the internet and people are taking their laptops to Starbucks. Like, I get that, but they're also able to kick people off, right? So when somebody brings a laptop in and it's infected, I just boot them out. Like, you're not allowed in my network. Like, you can't do that in OT. Like, at least not at the same speed and in the same way. Like, my response is always, when I'm talking to people, my run book or my response plan on the OT side is to pick up the phone and call the engineer. Like, I'm never going to kick off an OT device because I don't know what the downstream impacts of that could be. Like, I could break a system, I could brick it, I could cause life and limb, kill someone. There's all sorts of impacts that I just don't experience on the IT side. So I have a lot more power, and the OT SOC or the IT SOC analyst is able to take a positive action and kick people off to prevent things. Whereas on the OT side, like, it's a lot more reactive. And again, when I also don't know what devices I have in my environment, I'm not playing with a full deck of cards. Like, I am two hands tied behind my back, and one eye covered up. Like, it's an uphill battle.
It really is. And that's it. I think that's a great example because, what if you're monitoring your OT network? You're actually there, right? You're up, you're running, you're monitoring, and you get indications of compromise on, say, a safety system. You're going to boot that safety system off? You're gonna kill it? You can't, right? So that changes your incident response. That changes, are you now going to have to put a whole plant in downtime to fix a problem? Those are things that are likely to come up if you have an incident in this environment, and that you've got to plan for. And you've got to brief leadership at all levels about and tell them, hey, if this happens, we're going to have to do this, which means X to you. And then, hopefully they'll come back and say, well, okay, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And it's like, well, I can't, don't oversell, right?
Sure.
That's one thing I get cautious of too. Everybody's like, oh, well, if you do this, nothing bad will ever happen. That works until it doesn't. That works really well until the bad thing happens, and then all your credibility's gone, right? But you can tell them, well, we can really minimize that risk if you invest here, right? Again, another lever to pull on to help with that OT. But paint that picture, understand those things going in, and when you go and try to paint that picture and you don't have an asset inventory, you don't have many colors to play with, right? You're not going to understand much of the picture. So
yeah, that you had a great point there too, right? Is having that asset inventory, having that understanding of what I have, where my risks are. Some people, it's like, doing your taxes or whatever. You put your head in your sand. You don't want to pay attention. You don't want to think about it or whatever, right? But when you know about it, you're able to respond. You're able to plan for. You're able to, start thinking about, I need to budget for this. Like, you can't just pull money out of the sky and expect to be able to implement these systems, hire people, bring in consultants, grab technologies, all these kind of things. I need to know where my limitations are so that I can communicate those things up the chain, all the way up, to the C-suite and the board, so that they understand what the risks are. Because ultimately, all of this ties back to, whether it's IT, whether it's OT, cybersecurity, and all this stuff, it ties back to business risk. And when we can tie these things back to business risk and there's a so what? If this happens, that scenario, this plant goes down. It could be down for 3 days. How much money will we lose? And how many people are we going to have to bring in? An incident response. And maybe we damage a line, and then I've got to replace equipment. And then, all of these possible outcomes. And then dollar signs start, ringing, the cash register, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And then the board's like, okay, wait, what would it cost for us to reduce that risk? To your point, not to zero, but this is the acceptable line of risk. Right now we're up here. What if we got right below that line? Like, what would it take us to get there?
And I think I like too that we're switching our focus on impact in risk. COVID's a great example. We were so big about likelihood and impact and how that's risk, but the likelihood of COVID was incredibly low. Yeah. But the impact was we weren't ready for it. We'd never planned for it, right? Nobody had. Yeah. Nobody was ready. So impact, and impact is at the end of the day what matters to the business, because you may have an impact that is so great, you say, I don't care what the likelihood is, and you're going to have these impacts. Sure. Regardless of how big of a business you are, there is something that impacts you in a way that likelihood doesn't matter, right? So understanding that impact, and then when you're reducing risk, maybe it's not just reducing the likelihood of it happening, but it's also reducing the felt impact if something were to happen, right? So sometimes reducing risk is compensating controls to reduce likelihood. Sometimes reducing risk is better recovery. It's better tabletopping. It's better planning. It's better, things like that so that you're ready. It's having extra things on hand. It's talking to the engineers. Hey, how do I replace that one-of-a-kind system if it gets dumped, right? Do you have backups? So a lot of those controls don't always reduce the likelihood, which I think we've focused on for a long time. Yeah. It's also how do we reduce the impact if it were to happen?
Which the ironic thing is we do this all the time on the OT side of the house, right? So on the operational side, like we're building redundant systems. They know exactly what happened. If that line goes down, that operator knows exactly what to do to get it back up in line. The problem is that they've never considered the scenarios of a cyber incident. And again, the vendors love to talk about, nation state attacks and malware and ransomware, but that's not always the incident. Sometimes it's just the network switch fails or whatever fails, but it is on the technology side of the house where the operator may not be as knowledgeable and may not be able to troubleshoot it. So they may not have the tools or the skill set to be able to get it back up and running. That's part of that overall risk understanding and to your point, playbook of if these things happen, this is how I respond. Having the spare things on the shelf, having spare Ethernet cables and testers and people that are trained to be able to troubleshoot the networking side of things, to be able to get things back up and running.
Yeah, and it could be a firewall rule, right? Because again, you if you don't know your environment, you don't know data flows, who knows what rule you change and what that device was talking to that you had no clue it was communicating with, right? I do think also when those happen, they need to be dissected, right? You need to understand what happened because they are great kind of peeks into what your cyber incident may look like, right? Hey, we lost communication with this that we didn't know we're even supposed to talk to. We did it to ourselves. It was bad. These things happened. This is what we did to fix it. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again, right? What if it happened maliciously instead of us just doing it to ourselves? So sometimes those are great areas to look into to say, hey, this is how, this is something we can't have happen because we saw a taste of what it was going to be like.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that I've seen in the years of working in OT. We do really well, something trips, something goes down, the operators, respond, they get it back up and running, they do a lessons learned, they document, this is what happened, this is how we fixed it, all that kind of stuff. I've seen that lagging on the OT side. And I think part of that is because the people that are doing those exercises don't have the knowledge of the technology side of things. And there's not a representative at the table that can represent that stuff and talk to those things, right? So I think overall, like if I were king for a day and I could fix things, I think it's more people and process than it ever is technology. And again, my board is probably going to kick me for this, but it's not. It rarely is it a technology problem. It rarely is a I need to buy this product and put it in my environment and that'll solve all my problems. Because again, like I said before, there is no silver bullet. So having trained people is way more powerful than having the best products in the world, whatever they are. Now, granted, you need products. Like, you don't want to do it all, Rambo and by yourself, and not. Products absolutely help you. But without the right people and processes, they are almost useless. You're just wasting your money, throwing it out the window, right? You have to have the right people at the table, having the right conversations that can push those concerns up the board and understand when those incidents happen, to document. Because if the operator that's responding doesn't understand the technology, he's just going to say, I don't know, I rebooted and it came back up. I don't know why it worked, but that's what happened, right?
Yeah. People and processes, again, when I think foundationally, right? I talk about like asset management, network diagram. I sound like a broken record, right? Data flow diagram. But I consider they are controls in some frameworks,
Sure.
but I consider them foundational elements of any successful program, that if you don't have those in place, you're not ready for the framework, right? Don't pass go, get this done first, then go into the other controls. And people and processes, if you don't have the people and processes, you can't do those things either, right?
Sure.
You're building processes as part of those foundational blocks, but if you don't have the people, you can't do that. And that's, again, back to programs. Building successful programs require investments in people, processes, and then technology. And technology should enable those people and processes. You don't buy it if you need a crutch. If you're looking for a crutch, technology's not going to work. It'll work for a little bit. A lot of times it'll look like it's working, which is almost more dangerous.
Yeah.
But it should enable your people and processes.
Yeah, going back to old school of back in the day, we thought putting in firewalls, that was enough, right? Well, I've got a firewall. I'm good. Like, I don't need anything else. I've got a firewall.
I've segmented.
I've segmented. I'm good. Like, or I'm air gapped. I love that one too. Like, oh, my environment's not connected. It's fine. Like, I don't need to do any of this cybersecurity stuff because I'm air gapped. And it's just like, that stops one attack vector. And I've said this a couple of times on the podcast, but there's a story where I worked in a nuclear power plant, and they had a vendor that brought in and was doing maintenance on a crane in the controlled area. Crane is not connected to network, anything like that. It's an isolated system. And 2 outages in a row, it got hit with malware. And what happened? And they did all the right steps. They followed the compliance and all that kind of stuff. But the vendor's laptop had malware on it. So when he plugged into the device, it downloaded it. The problem was the malware that was on it there was no signature in the antivirus that we were scanning it with. So every time it passed, check. Okay, you're good. Go ahead. And he put it right back in the front door. It wasn't until the second time that it happened, because we scanned the system when we were trying to fix it, right? Nothing came up. We didn't find any malware or anything like that. So we just reset from a known good state, and everything was good for the next 18 months. It wasn't until the second time they were like, okay, something's going on here. Like, what is it? And that's when it was kind of discovered. But the point is the disconnecting or air gap, or all those things, those are great ideas. I'm not saying they're not good strategies in an overall program for your critical systems, but it is not enough by itself to protect your environment.
Absolutely. And those devices, unless they are truly just bricks, right? If they have some kind of IT component to them, you're getting data to them somehow. CNC machines, one of the biggest things I see in past lives and current life, CNC machines. A lot of times they're off network.
Yep.
And this is a big thing in CMMC. A lot of the DIB is running small shops with CNC machines.
Yep.
And people are like, my CNC machines are off network. I'm going, how do you program them? And they're like, oh, with this thumb drive. Like, oh, okay, where'd you get the thumb drive? Like, oh, a vendor came in the other day and gave it to me. Like, right? Like, happens all the time. And it's like, they're not air gapped. Sure, they're air gapped, but you're still getting data there, right? You're still pulling data from them, and the data you're giving them and the data you're pulling is incredibly important because it makes the widget, and we need the widget to go make money. So, that understanding, and when I talk about, network diagrams and data flow diagrams especially, draw those paths. Network diagrams should show those air gap connections. Data flow diagrams should describe how you cross those connections. Yeah. Is it a sneaker net with a thumb drive? Is it a laptop you're taking over? Et cetera, so that and you can build that into your security program.
Yeah, and that's the thing is most of the time when you walk into these places, they show the network diagram. They don't show, well, that's air gap, so I don't even include it on my drawing. Right. I don't include it in my asset inventory. I don't include any of that stuff. Like, a lot of the technologies in the OT space, and we have it in our product, passive network monitoring. That's a great thing to do because you can see all of the stuff, except the things that are not network connected. What do you do about
Right.
those? Do you not include them in your inventory? Do you not care about them? Do they not matter? Like, they absolutely matter. Like, and I'm not, again, I'm not downplaying any of that, because again, we have that in our capability, but it's just one capability of a bigger understanding of what my environment is. And I need to care about those other devices, the serial devices, the devices that are hardwired. All that stuff is part of my overall understanding. If I were going to go design a manufacturing facility and the engineering drawings, and I look at those, everything that's on there needs to be part of my understanding of my environment, not just the things that are network connected. I shouldn't be deleting things out. I should be explaining how those things are connected, to your point, because we bridge those gaps. Because when it's Saturday night, it's 3:00 in the morning, and the vendor says, well, I need to be able to help you, and I'm in a different state, just connect that thing in, and I'll get to it, and I'll help you, right?
Yep.
How many times does that happen?
Every time. Every time. And to your point, I'm building the one. I hope going forward we are much better at holding on to those engineering diagrams,
Right.
and those integrator diagrams, because they're crucially important. Crucially important that we stay up to date on that we keep those, that security's involved. But also, I think that's an interesting perspective too. We focus a lot in our trainings, in our other things, on greenfield, right? We talk a lot about, like, if you're going to build OT, here's how you build it. Here's how we don't talk about how that's different in existing environments, right? We say, here's the Purdue model. You should strive for the Purdue model. We don't say how you carve the Purdue model out of an existing environment that's been running for 100 years, right? And I think a lot of us, Electric got over a lot of this hump, right? They had to go through and again do those things, but in manufacturing, in these areas that are really starting to take a hard look over the last few years, they're now, how do I do that, right? A lot of people started with microsegmentation, like you talked about, firewalls and segmentation. Great place to start. But again, how did you know what you segmented if you didn't do these other things first? Yeah. So I get it that you have to eat the elephant one bite at a time, kind of to your point about the auditor thing. So segmentation is a great bite to take first. It's just not my favorite bite to take first. I think those foundational controls, understanding your environment, building the people and the processes, and then going from there is the best place to start.
Yeah, and I've seen so many organizations take that the wrong direction. They start with their architects going to a conference or seeing some technology because they know that there's some problems. They know they have problems with asset inventory, for instance. So they go buy a tool that'll help them with, inventorying their environment, right? And again, it's not that it's a wrong step, and I'm not implying that it is, right? It's just not the only step. If that's the only step you're taking, then it's the wrong step. Something is better than nothing. But still, like, you need to understand what these environments are doing. Where you need to make sure that cyber is part of your overall architecture design. So they're at the table with the engineers, with the operators, with the operations team that's running the facility, because they need to be responding. They need to be understanding what's going on in these environments, and so they don't design products that are going to break the system. They understand the shortcomings and limitations. All of these things go together, and backwards and forwards. So when the new engineer is looking to buy a new PLC or retrofit something, they're not doing a insecure, bad design. They're doing it to say, hey, instead of going the way we've always done it, if we take one little step this way, we'll we'll reduce our risk and improve our overall understanding of the environment, right? All of those things work both directions.
Yeah. Call security early too, because more often than not, we see that I think that security gets brought in late, right? Because they're a check on a lot of procurement cycles now, where, like, hey, we're already buying the thing, we need security to approve it. Security's like, whoa, what is this thing? So work proactively to bring security in early when the engineer wants to buy the thing, so that you can do that secure by design type stuff early.
So what's some of the biggest struggles or difficulties in understanding asset management and asset inventory in manufacturing?
Where to start? That's tough, right? And convincing people that there is likely to be, initially at least, there's going to be some kind of manual effort. Like, sure. I love automation. Absolutely love automation. Automate anything you can. But when you're building out that initial one, again, the air gap devices, those other things, you can't do it without going out and getting an understanding of those real environments. So getting people to understand that you're going to have to go out and walk around and put boots on the ground and touch things and see what happens and see what they do and understand what they are is crucial. I think that getting people to understand that piece going into it is a big hill. But once you get past that, right, and you've done that initially, then you can let the automation take over, right? Then you can keep things up to date. Then you can get in your procurement cycles, and it's like, hey, we're buying this new thing. Like, okay, let's go talk about it, make sure it's included in the asset inventory. But building the initial, that's where it's difficult. And I think it's important to realize that you're likely going to have to go do a manual effort as part of it. You have to walk around and say, what about that dusty old PLC? What's it doing? They're like, oh, you know what? We haven't looked at that one in a while, and we only use that when we make this one product every 5 years. And we didn't include it, right? That takes an on-the-ground effort, I think, to get done.
Yeah, it's so funny because you look out there, and again, coming from consulting, all these different places, right? And everybody wants it easy, cheap, and fast, right? And it's that old development thing of you can have it, 2 of the 3, but you can't have it. It can't be cheap, easy, and fast, right? It just can't.
Right.
But they want this passive, automated asset inventory that's also 100% accurate. So passive monitoring is awesome, and it gets you some of the stuff. But you hit on a few of them, right? And we talked about it already. But you're not going to get things that are on the network. It's not going to be 100% accurate. Like just know what it is. It's not that it's a bad tool. It's just you have to understand what you're getting. You can't oversell it. And I've seen that so many times is, hey, if we get this, then we'll have a complete understanding of our asset inventory. And then we won't have to do any manual work. We'll be able to use this for supply chain security and all of these, vulnerability management and all this stuff. It checks all these boxes, and we don't have to hire a single person. We don't have to walk down a single site, and we're good.
Right.
And I don't know if that's because the vendors oversold it or if the people didn't understand it. It's probably a little bit of both. But ultimately, there is no easy fix. Like, it's like losing weight. It took you years to get where you are. If I need to lose 50 pounds, I didn't gain 50 pounds overnight. So why would I assume that I'm going to be able to lose it overnight, right? And I'm going to have to put in the work. I'm going to have to be consistent, and it's not going to be easy. Now, it's worth it. Once I gain that, or once I get to my goal, it's easier to maintain than it is to lose the 50 maybe. But I still have to put in the work, right? And I can't overpromise and say, it's like all the diet pills you see online. Like, you don't have to work out, and you don't have to change your diet, and you're going to lose all this weight. No, that's not how this shit works.
Yeah, I think there's 2 threads I really want to pull on there. The first one is, and the problem with these tools is not the problem with the tools. I like the tools. I like the vendors. There's great tools out there. The problem is it can look like you have 100% of the picture.
Right.
If you don't know better, you can take that tool, let it go do its thing, and say, I've got it. I've got 100% of my asset inventory. And again, the unknown unknowns will get you. That area that you didn't account for because you didn't know your environment will get you, and you won't even know where it's coming from. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing to remember about them is, and probably one of the reasons that they've been so successful and we're at this point is all of a sudden you turn that tool on and you've got 10,000 new devices that you didn't see before, and you're like, look at that, I'm there.
Yep.
But you don't realize you have 10,100 devices or 10,050 devices, right? So I think that's an important piece of it where the overselling happens. The other point on losing weight, like, yes, it is easier to stay at that same weight, but plan for the sustainment, right? And we lose that sometimes. I think that's so important in compliance, especially, is don't just focus on mitigating those controls and saying, I'm audit ready, and then passing the audit. These audits are now regular, right? Yeah. Plan for, how do I stay there? Yeah. How do I keep going? How do I sustain that compliance? How do I sustain that security? Keep that in all your planning and budgeting and everything else. I think it's important.
Yeah, that's a key thing there is you've got to maintain it. Like, you've got to stay there. It's never ending. And that's the other thing that I think that's really needs to be part of this overall understanding when you're talking to the board, when you're talking to the C-suite, when you're building these programs, is it's easy to, for whatever reason, it seems to be easier to get capital, dollars to stand up a program, to buy a tool, to implement something. But then who takes it over, and who manages it and maintains it?
Right.
And do you have? And it's not just about the support contract on the hardware and the software licensing, right? It's also the people. Who's going to run
people.
it?
Yep.
Who's going to run it? Who's going to make sure that you're getting the value out of it, that it's seeing the things and you're taking the needed actions? Because and again, this, I know we sound like we're beating a drum here, but it all goes back to that overarching program and understanding it's not just people, it's not just process. Technology is an important factor to make sure that I'm getting the best out of my environment. But again, if I don't have all of those things there, it's like it's a three-legged stool. In any one of those, if I don't have it, then maybe I can balance for a while, but eventually I'm going to fall.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to have all three. I think we've hit on there's an order we think they should go in, but you got to have all three, right?
Yeah.
And again, you have to invest in those people, and it's not a one-time hire, right? You don't hire somebody and forget about them. You have to invest in training them and making sure they stay current and making sure they understand emerging threats and emerging technologies. And you're right. It's not just a capital spend up front. We have to look at what's the ongoing cost of keeping this going. And we need to brief their leadership because they have to understand that as part of their return on investment and part of their risk picture, right? If you sell them a $1 million solution to a problem that's going to reduce their risk from critical to low, but in reality, it's $1 million a year, or it's $1 million up front with $250,000 a year. If you told them that whole picture, they're going to look at that calculus very differently, and they should look at it differently.
Sure.
But yeah, you got to understand that piece.
Yeah, it's really understanding the big picture and looking at it and understanding sometimes your baby's ugly, and you are where you are. You can't change that. It's like, again, I go back to the fat loss thing. You look in the mirror, you are where you are. There's no shame in it. You're there. You have to know where you are so that you can know how to, when you're trying to go on vacation, you have to put in two things to be able to get from where you want to go to where you have to put in where you start and where you want to go. I mean, maybe you'll eventually get where, but you have to know both things to be able to navigate.
Right.
Both things are important.
And I think it's so important. That's a good point too. Call the baby ugly.
Yeah.
Be willing to call it ugly. Compliance is such a big thing in compliance, even in the consulting world. And I've spent time as a consultant.
Sure.
Say it outright.
Yeah.
You failed.
Yeah.
You do not meet the standard. You don't walk around that, right? And it's the same thing with security. We are not where we need to be. We have these gaps. We have these risks. We did not go far enough. People are afraid to do that because they think it's taking blame or it's going to make them look bad. But I look at it the other way. I look at it as this is how we build effective programs, right?
Yeah.
Is having that honest. If you build something and it's not right, own something like that as a security program, right? But more open communication about where you're at is so important, I think.
Yeah, one of my mentors a long time ago said all business is a people business, and it doesn't matter if you're a janitor, the CEO, doesn't matter, right? So all of this is selling. All of this is being able to communicate and take complex, which is why I love this podcast, is having awesome, interesting conversations like this, and to be able to put it in layman's terms. And that doesn't mean that you and I are necessarily smarter than anybody else. It's just our experiences have allowed us to see things that we can then translate so that others can say, oh, okay, I understand that, because maybe you don't like compliance for whatever reason, or maybe you don't really understand why firewalls aren't enough, or whatever those things are. But when you're able to have simple conversations and be able to communicate these things in ways that make people say, have that aha moment, right? This is what helps us get from where we are to where we need to go. And sometimes it's just as simple as a conversation. Sometimes it's just as simple as pointing out those shortcomings and saying, have you thought about this? What about this, right? And it's like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Like that PLC you talked about. Oh, I didn't think about that one. We don't ever use that one. I haven't used it in 5 years. But yeah, I didn't include that. Should I have?
Yeah. And I'm not saying like when you say you failed, don't paint the picture as the sky is falling, right?
Sure.
Always paint how we get to, like you said, where we want to go and how we get there.
Yeah.
Fill in the gaps in between. But I think you've hit on something that's really important, and that is you got to know where you're starting from and where you want to end up. If you don't put those in first, you can't build the steps in between. And what is that goal where you want to end up? I think a lot of people let perfect get in the way of good enough, right? That goal doesn't have to be every single NIST control implemented, right? It does for compliance. You do have to meet your compliance requirements, right?
Sure.
But everything else is a risk decision.
Yeah.
So you have to meet your compliance requirements. Everything else is a risk decision. So designate that risk level you're willing to accept, and then plan backwards from there.
Yeah, and if you do that and you're planning an overall program, nobody will go, full maturity 5 on NIST CSF or
Nobody does.
Whatever.
Yeah.
You can say that all day long you want, but nobody will actually effectively implement that. It's too expensive, too many people. You'll never hit the target. So be real.
Yeah.
I'm going to accept this risk. I'm going to be a 1. I'm going to be extremely immature. It's going to be a manual process on this one. Whereas this one over here, I want to be a 4. I want to be automated. I want it to be, more dynamic, because that's where I want to focus on these assets, right? And being real about that, because that's another thing is when I would go and do these assessments, everybody would think, oh, I'm going to be a 4 or a 5. Like, no, you're not. Like, you're not going to patch every system in an OT environment daily. Like, you're just not ever.
Nope.
That's never going to be the goal. So you shouldn't pretend that it is. Like, that's not what success looks like. Success does not look like putting 5s on everything. Success looks like putting real attainable goals that I actually can implement in my environment safely and effectively.
Yeah. GRC's gotten so it's taking off, right? Governance is in this, and I look at it as a triangle, and I look at compliance is what you must do, right?
Yeah.
You have to meet your compliance requirements. Risk is you deciding what else you want to do, right? And compliance is part of risk, right? You could decide not to meet a compliance requirement, and there's a risk acceptance piece there, and
sure.
The legality of that, right? But risk is another piece. So what you must do, what you're willing to accept, and then the governance comes out of that, because it's to make sure you meet those 2 things, right? And that's, I think, if you look at it that way, and if you accept, and I'm so excited, by the way, that the CSF has governance in it. I think it's awesome. A lot of people, I think, are frustrated over that because of the new requirements, but I think it's a move in the right direction. But yeah, you're right. You've got to have that continued governance and that risk management baked in.
Awesome, man. This has been a great conversation. So I'll leave you with this, and I asked everybody this question, right? I even prepped you for it. So in the next 5 to 10 years, what's something that maybe you're excited about coming up, and maybe something that's concerning that's coming up over the horizon?
So I don't think I'll surprise anybody about this, but what I'm excited about is that the manufacturing industry, all parts of OT and ICS, are starting to get that compliance lever. That excites me. The auditors are coming, but it's a good thing in my mind. I spend a lot of time frustrating over it, right? And a lot of time, like anybody else, right? Like, okay, how do we get ready? But I think it's a good thing for industry and for our ecosystem. Things I'm worried about, and I think you can pick this out of what we've talked about, is falling for a buzzword instead of building a program. I think that's going to continue to be a program moving forward. And I don't say buzzword because it's not effective. AI is incredibly effective. Blockchain has its uses, right? Zero trust. That's probably my biggest pet peeve, right? Is people falling for zero trust before they have an asset inventory, right? So don't fall for a buzzword, build a program. I think we're going to have to keep watching out for that moving forward.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Hey, thank you for your time today, sir. Is there anything you want the audience to know, any call to actions or anything like that?
No, I mean, thanks. It was great talking, and I'm glad we got to get together.
Awesome, man. Hey, I'm sure people will see you at your next SANS conversation, conference, et cetera, when you're speaking. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.